Some of you are familiar with these words of Maria Mitchell, the 19th century Unitarian and astronomer who was the first woman elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Small as is our whole system compared with the infinitude of creation, brief as is our life compared with the cycles of time, we are so tethered to all by the beautiful dependencies of law that not only the sparrow's fall is felt to the uttermost bound, but the vibrations set in motion by the words that we utter reach through all space, and the tremor is felt through all time. We're seeing that play out right now, and it's why I'm the only one here in our sanctuary this morning. The new Omicron wave of the coronavirus pandemic is raging out of control because, first, we are interdependent, and second, we act like we're not. We are interdependent, but we act like we're not. Interdependence is a fact. Unitarian Universalists officially made it part of our theology almost 40 years ago, when the seventh principle was written, affirming and promoting respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Obviously, it was part of our faith long before. Mitchell wrote about interdependence 150 years ago, and it's long been a concept in older religions too. Most people don't disagree with interdependence, at least as an intellectual proposition. Only a child or a true narcissist would deny that we depend on one another and the world around us. The problem is that we often act like we're not interdependent. And the result is a range of catastrophes, from the coronavirus pandemic to global climate change. So I'm not going to talk to you about interdependence. As I said, the problem isn't a matter of intellect. Rather, I want to show you interdependence. And I'm going to do so using the 3,000-year-old Hindu imagery of Indra's net. So I invite you to settle into a comfortable position. You may want to sit up, place your feet flat on the floor, allow your hands to rest loosely in your lap. And I invite you to close your eyes to allow your imagination to well up within you. Imagine, if you will, a great net spun with delicate intricacy, adorned with lovely jewels, and stretching out in all directions. This is the magnificent net of the great god Indra. Let us look upon it and wonder. Indra's net is like a spider's web in its intricacy and loveliness. But this is no ordinary weaving, for it spans the infinity of time and space. At each place where the threads of the net connect to one another, a single glittering jewel has been hung. And since the net is infinite in dimension, there are an infinite number of jewels too. They stretch out across the vastness of existence, suspended in and supported by the net, catching the light and twinkling like the stars. It is a beautiful sight to behold. Imagine selecting one of the jewels for a closer look. Perhaps it catches your eye with its color or its luster. As you inspect this particular jewel, you notice first its cut and polished surfaces, the source of its glittering. But then you see, in this jewel there are reflections of the other jewels of the net, and not just a few, but all of the other jewels in their infinite array. Each jewel in Indra's net is reflected in every other jewel, an infinite process of reflection. Now understand that each sparkling jewel is a being, non-living as well as living, a human, a plant, an animal, from the most majestic redwood to the lowliest worm. Each being is connected to every other by the net. Each is reflected in every other. We are all here, shining on and influencing one another. A change in one jewel, in one being, in one person, will result in a change, however slight, in every other. Everything affects everything else in this interdependent web of all existence. Pull back now and see more of Indra's net again. See how ripples of glittering light pass across it, pass through it. Think about what ripples you might be sending out across the web of all existence. After all, when we harm even a single part of the net, we harm the entire web. In the same way, though, every helpful action will send positive ripples throughout the infinite net, lighting up every jewel, every being, every life. Let us reflect on this for just a moment longer. My colleague, the Reverend Teresa Soto, who serves the mission of the First Unitarian Church of Oakland in California, has written that some people are used to keeping the rules. Don't cross the road when the light is red, only sensible. It turns out that keeping rules isn't the same as keeping covenant, which asks us, instead of keeping a bright line, to keep our promises. To what have we promised ourselves? To this moment in time and place, to this community, and even tenderly interconnected, this planet. We promise ourselves to the idea that we are each and all human beings. We promise that there is something moving between us that we cannot tame and cannot measure. There are two ways in which we respond to the fact of interdependence, two ways we live into our interdependence. The first of these comes from the obvious fact that when we are in interdependent relationship with one another, it helps things go more smoothly when we're on the same page as much as possible. If I know what things you don't like, I'll try not to do them. If you know what things I like, you will try to do them. That's just the golden rule. If we can be honest about what we hope will happen in our relationship, and also about what we're afraid will happen, then we can figure out how to work together to realize our hopes and avoid our fears. It should go without saying that since none of us are mind readers, we have to actually talk about this to figure it out. And when we have some ideas about how we need to agree to treat one another, whether we make explicit promises or otherwise establish common expectations about our behavior, then we have a covenant. I know that covenant is a scary word for some people. Even though we UUs pride ourselves on being the most anti-authoritarian people there are out there, we still worry that covenant will be imposed on us by some outside authority. But a UU covenant, by definition, arises from within the group making the covenant. If it's not the result of reciprocity and mutual agreement, then it's not a covenant. Here's how the UUA's Commission on Appraisal described it in their report last summer. The first major function of religion is to welcome people into moral communities. For Unitarian Universalists, covenant defines both the relationship that forms around that moral core and the process of the relationship's creation. Covenant is never imposed from outside, but emerges organically through mutual promises in response to the honest expression of hopes and fears, likes and dislikes, and how we expect to be treated by one another. Of course, once a group has developed their own covenant, then it's a matter of living it. Sometimes that's easier said than done. And it may be that the covenant needs to be revised if the group realizes that's necessary. But there's a power in covenant that only comes from living it, from living out our interdependence. As the Commission on Appraisal puts it, part of the power of covenant is the guidance it provides in distinguishing between behavior and individual worth. When we are all assumed to be of equal worth, then it becomes possible to address behavior that appears to be out of covenant without attacking or compromising an individual's worth. Now, nobody ever said that being in relationship, in community, is easy. It takes work to keep our promises, especially if they are promises worth keeping. It requires us to be accountable for our actions. Again, not to some outside vengeful authority, but to the people with whom we have lovingly made those promises. And when somebody does something that's out of covenant, that's going to take a conversation, maybe a hard conversation, to make things right again. And that's going to require courage and commitment. But we do it because we want to be in relationship with one another and because community matters. As the Commission on Appraisal puts it, covenant requires that we be present to and for each other, that we engage in community, and that we work together for the good of the entire community. The power of covenant keeps us in community together. It seeks to prevent us from walking away when that might be the easy thing to do. It requires that we be accountable to ourselves and to each other. You'll be hearing more about this in the coming months through Sunday services, cottage meetings, workshops, and more, because 2022 is the UUFP's Year of Living Covenantally. You may know of the book, The Year of Living Biblically, which describes author A.J. Jacobs' attempt to follow the Bible as literally as possible for a year. Well, we have a much easier task to spend this year going deeper than ever before with our central Unitarian Universalist practice of covenant. After all, many of us are now familiar with making covenants, thanks to fellowship circles and other programs. But how do we actively keep a covenant so that it's living and not just nice words on a page? And what do we do when some behavior breaks covenant? That's an area in which we need some practice for sure. And then how do we remake the covenant again? That's got to be part of the process too, because covenant is not only the container for religious community, it's also the vehicle by which we restore and deepen our relationships through mutual trust and vulnerability. You'll be invited to participate in this year of living covenantally in a variety of ways, including a workshop I'm leading on Saturday, January 29th, where we'll watch and then discuss a conversation on covenant hosted by the UUA's Article 2 Study Commission. And then beginning next month, a number of small group cottage meetings hosted by our Committee on Ministry. So please respond to those invitations when you receive them. If you're on our Facebook group, you've already received an invitation. And together, we'll start unlocking the power of covenant. A couple of Sundays ago, I quoted my esteemed colleague, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, who wrote that the central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. There are two ways in which we respond to the fact of interdependence, two ways we live into our interdependence. The first, as I said before, is our practice of covenant. The second is by working for justice. After all, when we recognize the fact of interdependence, when we face the undeniable existential reality of our connectedness, when we understand that every sparkling jewel that adorns Indra's net is a being, whether plant or animal or person, then we have a responsibility to live into our interdependence by striving not just for calm, but for peace, not just for equality, but for equity, not just for freedom, but for liberation, not just for fairness, but for justice. In other words, justice, like community, is a consequence of interdependence, a result of living and practicing our theology of interdependence with one another. Indeed, the reason we work for justice as UUs isn't just because we think it's a good idea or because our 7 principles say we should. Rather, it's because working for peace, equity, liberation, and justice is an inspired consequence of living into our interdependence. As UU President, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray writes in the current issue of UU World, there are those who mistakenly believe that justice is the heart of our faith as Unitarian Universalists. What I so appreciate about Morrison Reed's words is the clarity that our theology, our understanding that there is a connectedness, comes first. Our work for justice and equity, our work to dismantle white supremacy culture, racism and oppression in ourselves and in our world is the faithful response to our theology of interdependence. So as UUs, it's our theology of interdependence that informs both our practice of covenant and our work for justice. It's why we talk about beloved community too, because covenant is how we live the beloved community within our walls, and justice is how we grow the beloved community in the world at large. It's why our 7 principles mention justice twice, as well as worth, dignity, equity, compassion, acceptance, encouragement, freedom, responsibility, conscience, democracy, peace, and liberty. It's why our 7th principle is about interdependence. It's why the proposed eighth principle is about beloved community. This month, as we remember Dr. King and his work to grow the beloved community, many UU congregations will be quoting his words, including these from one of the readings in our hymn book. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The fact is that our interdependence is undeniable. But when we fail to act like we're interdependent, the results, as we are seeing, are catastrophic, from global climate change to the coronavirus pandemic. Living at odds with our interdependence, fighting the inescapable network of mutuality is injustice, because the burden of suffering inevitably falls on those who have the least ability to shoulder it. An annual tradition for many years now, the 30 Days of Love is coming up, running from Dr. King Day through Valentine's Day. Followed by many UU congregations and individual UUs too, this is a month of intentionally engaging with our interdependence by growing spiritually, deepening our relationships, and working for justice. This year, 30 Days of Love will focus on 4 intersectional priorities, one each week, beginning with reproductive, gender, and LGBTQ justice, and including Reproductive Justice Sunday on January 23rd for the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. The other priorities are democracy and voting rights, decriminalization and racial justice, and climate justice. And then 30 Days of Love wraps up with Side with Love Sunday on February 13th. You can sign up yourself for more information about the various activities to ground, grow, and act together for justice on the Side with Love website. And otherwise, look for details in our emails and Facebook posts. 30 Days of Love is, of course, just one way to live into our interdependence by working for justice. Coming up this week, as you heard in the announcements, is our 8th Principle Town Hall on Thursday evening, and the Jubilee 3 anti-racism training that starts Friday evening. For more information on either of those, please contact Lucy Van Tyne. And next week is the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy's Days for All People, when we learn about legislative issues and lobby our representatives on what matters for us. However you choose to get involved, you will find, of course, that you are not alone. Remember, one of those sparkling jewels in Indra's net is you. You are a glittering part of realizing the promise of beloved community. So let's light up the interdependent web together. May it be so.